Welcome everybody to this episode of Something Epic. I am really excited because as a big fan of the show, as me as a big fan of technology and everything that's kind of coming to the video game space, that we are always thinking about talking to folks who are on that cutting edge of the technology sphere. And I don't think there's anyone else that I would rather have on the show today but Galen Davis, who's the senior evangelist for Quixel. I am really excited to have you on the show because I have been singing the praises of the technology that you work around every day. And people are like, Kahlief, shut the hell up because I don't know what Quixel is. I know it looks cool and I know that it does cool stuff, but I don't know exactly what it is. So I was like, you know what? Let's bring on someone who knows exactly what this tech is here for and what it does. So thank you so much for being here with me on Something Epic. How are you doing? How is everything going?
Hey, I'm good. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm so excited. This is going to be a ton of fun. So yeah, no, everything's good. Lots of stuff going on. It's busy around here as always. So it's a good time.
So I remember way back in the day when, we have mutual folks in common that we know industry wise. Shout out to Daryl, shout out to Joey. And hearing the work that, he was doing, it really was like, so what is Quixel? I see, conversations about it when we wind up seeing things like the Unreal State of Play often, when conversations are coming up, you see splash screens on video games now where, Quixel is front and center, popping up on that beginning screen before you start a game. For the folks at home who don't know exactly how this integrates into, Unreal Engine, what would be the explanation you would give to folks about what Quixel Tech does?
Yeah, so I can actually dial it back even to like kind of the beginning of the company and everything like that, if that's something you feel would be worth chatting about. Yeah,
so, for sure.
So our co-founders, they worked for a company called Starbreeze over in Sweden, and they specifically were solving problems on the art side that weren't really being solved at the time in the industry, right? So, they were really kind of early on in creating tools that really made artists' lives much easier and made it so that basically the level that which people were creating art assets specifically were exponentially increasing and saving a ton of time in the process, right? And anytime that there's new advancements in specifically creating art for any type of medium, whether it's games or film or anything, artists' ears perk up, right? People are genuinely interested in improving their own workflows and figuring out how we can obviously improve the quality of the industry wholesale. So, they started on some really simple tools back then to make artists' lives easier. And it really kind of snowballed from there, right? Like they were involved in some capture technology for like facial scans, like early on. And they were very primitive systems back then, right? But it laid a foundation for being able to basically capture performances and capture existing, kind of real world materials and digitize them, right? So basically they decided they were going to leave their jobs, and it's obviously a huge risk, right? Especially because they weren't really kind of getting a ton of respect, like in the things that they were doing at the company. I don't want to speak too much about that, but it was mostly just the fact that artists sometimes feel very threatened when they see something that's so revolutionary coming down the pipe. They're like, oh, well, that's going to, take away my job, right? Like, I'm not going to have a livelihood. Like if you guys create a system by which like, oh, what? So you're going to scan everything and then we just don't have to make stuff, right? Obviously, certain people might not take to that idea, especially at like kind of the first like intro of this kind of basic concept of photogrammetry early on, right? And so anyways, they basically kind of decided they were going to go off on their own, create a brand and a company, right? And start to create tools that were going to keep the lights on, but then basically have this kind of future vision down the road of being able to create a massive scan library of assets. So what does that mean, practically speaking? Basically, like when you boot up any modern, AAA game or anything like that looks photoreal or is, attempting to be realistic in nature, those assets have to come from somewhere, right? So artists either create them by hand, or there's a really kind of revolutionary way of kind of going about this, right? Which is actually capturing assets from the real world. So whether that's bespoke materials that make up the assets, the 3D components, or the actual 3D assets themselves, obviously have materials associated with them. We scan a wide variety of stuff. If you just go onto our website, you can take a look. I mean, it's basically, the way I like to talk about it is like, if you've ever been to one of those prop houses in LA, right, where people go to like shoot films, right? Like basically directors and production designers, everyone will just go to these massive warehouses, right? They'll show up with 10 U-Hauls, they'll fill everything they need to shoot their film, right? And they roll out to the set and then they shoot it. Obviously, it's more complicated than I'm describing it, but that's kind of the basic premise of it, right? So we have basically the digital equivalent of that. And so that basically saves artists a ton of time, right? And it obviously increases the quality, is what we believe, obviously, because we're sourcing from the real world, right? Making a realistic brick wall, just as like a simple example, incredibly complicated, right? Like I don't think it's one of those things that people really think about. Like you can do a loose sketch, kind of figure out something, get you sort of in the ballpark of like what it takes to make something photoreal. But sourcing from the real world is essentially the better way to go, just to overall increase the quality of what you're working on. So I know it's a really long answer to your question, but I think that kind of lays it out, I think.
No, I think that's perfect, because I think, one of the things I don't think a lot of audiences and a lot of folks who are in, who are not in the gaming industry understand is that when you're pulling these assets together, like you said, a lot of times, most of that stuff was modeled freehand. It was modeled from, reference photos or other pieces of things like that. And a lot of times you wind up having to, model those imperfections that really bring home that layer of realism within the items themselves. And now with Quixel being in the mix, now when you're, doing the scans of these things, all of that detail winds up coming in these really high res assets. When Quixel started the process of, matching up this need for the industry, because also, the conversation around, our teams outsourcing a lot of this work in those ways too, that also has become a part of the conversation about like how fast do games get built and how much can you put into stuff. The team has been around for around 7-8 years now. Is it even longer than that at this point?
Yeah,
you might have said a date. I might have just forgotten. It might have flown away.
Yeah, no, I think we're closing in on a decade. Yeah, I think as far as the brand itself. But yeah, Teddy and Wakar have probably been kicking around the idea for even longer than that. So
yeah. So I would assume at this point now, because of the, we'll give it a 10-year gap, the conversation from a technology standpoint has changed vastly in terms of, what you're able to do, how you're capturing these assets, and, how those assets then get into a space where you can go into the Unreal store and find, or in the bridge and go find these components and assets and meshes and things like that. How wild has it been for the team to see that growth happen alongside this work that they're doing?
Oh, it's crazy. I mean, the fact is that we are constantly refining the ingredients and the process and the recipes here for all this stuff, right? So if you go back, and you can still see some of these videos on our YouTube channel, actually, like there's old videos of the team kind of taking like the first prototypes of like the mega scanner, right? Back at, early days of the company, right? And they were loading like these giant boxes, like they were massive, right? It fit in the back of like pickup trucks, right?
Yeah.
And we have a huge amount of our team that does a lot of the back end and processing side and a lot of the engineering side actually in Pakistan. And so it's funny because at the time, like when they were kind of prototyping a lot of this stuff, this team would go out into the field, right? And they'd go and capture assets in the desert or in different places that they felt would be interesting, right? But taking this giant box that's covered in, like a tarp on the back of a flatbed truck in that part of the world was something that was definitely challenging, right? For engaging with local authorities, and everyone kind of explained like, we're just taking pictures,
right?
So that was like, it's interesting because like that was something that was definitely, the starting place for what now, we still have, lots of large equipment that we take in the field, but it's definitely refined. It's become a much more streamlined process for us. A lot of the rigs are actually handheld, right? And so we scan with drones as well. We still have kind of like box type prototype scanners that we do like for vegetation specifically, right? But for the most part, the assets that we're grabbing in the field are actually done with handheld rigs that are incredibly ergonomic. And I'm sure we can
Huh.
cut in some B-roll of some of the actual like
Yeah.
hardware itself. Basically, just we put a mirrorless camera in there, and we have big flash cross polarization rigs on the front of it to be able to get the images that we need in order to kind of take all that data, which is thousands and thousands of pictures of those assets, right? Compiling them back into our reality capture software, and then be able to generate meshes and surfaces and everything like that from those pictures. So the process changes, I think, just about every single time. To answer your question directly here, I think we've come a long way, and I think every time the team gets back from trips, they're constantly wanting to tweak the formula here, right? Like they're not completely satisfied with the way we're doing things. We can always streamline it. We can always make it better. We can always up the quality. And so the team is very dialed in on those aspects of the workflow.
That's fascinating, because I also forget, right? When you're thinking about when you're trying to capture not only, items, but surfaces, right? To try to get all of that detail and have it so that you have these kind of larger resolution assets. I am sure it must be super wild to kind of go into the field and say, all right, we're going to capture this side of a hill, or we're going to capture this brickwork or something to that effect. When it comes to those layers, is it something in which, well, I guess the question would be, how does the team know what to go for next when it's like, oh, so we have bricks are dope. We got all the bricks that we need. Trees, we got some of the trees we got. Like, how do you know, or how does the team kind of think about or talk about what's the next thing that they need to scan to kind of have it available for the dev community?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, we're obviously very dialed into like the metadata on the back end of like what people are actually downloading, right? So we know generally like what's trending, what people are really engaged with the most as far as what's in the library. So I think that's a good like starting place for us. And then also we just have a team of people who are constantly looking to fill the library with important and valuable things, right? I think that's something that's important for whenever we set out on an expedition. So I was actually in the Sierra Nevadas last week for a trip that we just did. And I mean, the amount of planning that went into just that trip on the front end is insane, right? Because it's not like you just sort of show up at a trailhead with cameras and you start pointing and shooting, right? Because you want to make sure that the juice is worth the squeeze for the team that's actually there, right? And the time that they're actually spending in the field is valuable and well, kind of maintained for the entire time that they're there. So, we have a really, really talented team that actually does really, really comprehensive breakdowns of eco regions specifically. And we make sure that we're able to kind of get a huge amount of data to be able to recreate a digital impression of the zone that they're actually in. So the scouting aspect of this is an insane part of the workflow, I would say. Like that's a huge part of it before we actually go and touch down with an entire team.
Oh, that really broadens that out into a whole other thing too. And I know we don't have a lot of time today to get into all the minutia, but I think even hearing you speak about it that way, I have a vision of like, when I go to a park here in Portland, of all the things that I see, and I'm like, for you to in the team to kind of go through that, and basically you're breaking it down as if you were digging through the earth and saying, all right, so we need this top layer, we need this middle layer, we need these surrounding pieces that would make up this scene. We need to capture each one of those things individually. Are you also seeing, you talked a little bit about like trends in what the community is kind of looking at. I feel like that also coincides with what the new hotness is of the day across what people are seeing from a technology standpoint. I think, one of the reasons we're doing this series is to give a little bit of a peek behind the curtain so that folks are understanding, just how hard it is to make a game in the world, right? And I think, we've seen the hotness right now is everyone is like, I need everything to be in UE5. And if it's not in UE5, then I don't want it. And if it doesn't have the sexiest textures on everything, then I don't want it. How much pressure does that also add to you all as a team to see that is a want, not only from the gaming industry, but from the community too, where they are now learning about some of this technology and then saying, well, this is what we have an expectation for current or next gen stuff to look like?
It's a huge amount of pressure, right? I mean, I think that, when you consider too, there are lots of teams that don't necessarily use photogrammetry for a lot of the systems that they create, and I think that there's a ton of merit behind that, right? I've shipped many games where there was basically, at the front, they made it very clear, like, we're not going to do any scanning for this, right? Like that's very, very key to us, is making sure that we hold on to the style that we're looking to preserve for what it is that we set out in our art direction Bible, right? Making sure that we match quality, for existing, projects that are going on. I think that's huge, right? Like, because it would really be unfortunate to release a bunch of really like beautiful scan assets that we're really proud of, and then just be completely shown up by another team, right? And they're doing it all manually or by hand or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that what that's done for us is basically we are looking very much towards the future as to how we can actually evolve the product as well. We want to make it so that the assets, as they currently exist, are kind of like a V1 of, what we think that people will actually be engaging with as far as digital assets in the future, right? So making assets smarter, right? Understanding the way that different, materials actually run across the surface, and what are the implications of, like, just as an example, right? Like moss sitting on a surface, right? What can we do to increase like the fidelity of like the moss as it sits on like the top of like a rock face, right? How do we actually procedurally generate all these different components that actually make those assets integrate better into the world? Like, those are all factors that we're considering when we're evolving the library. So I would say, as it currently exists, right, the library has a really amazing offering, right? It has tons and tons of assets, a wide variety of different content that's there. But I mean, we want to make it so that the library, first and foremost, has the highest quality bar, for anything you can find in the industry by far. And then secondly, we make it so it's diverse enough to where people can actually keep going back to the well, right? We don't want to create a product where it's like, all right, well, we've downloaded everything that we think we need for the next 3 games we're going to make or something like that. No, like, we're constantly adding value to the library. We want to make sure that people keep coming back and they still want to engage with it and make it better. So
that rocks. I love that. I love that explanation there, because that's one of the things I find is always the hardest, right? Where it's like, I think the gaming public has, again, this idea of what is the tangible feel of what next gen gaming is supposed to be. I mean, now current gen gaming, right? And I think everyone is looking at fidelity as the main threshold for it. I remember a couple of cycles ago, it was, holy crap, look at this volumetric fog. That was the hot thing for the day. And then it became water systems, and water systems became the thing of the day, where it was like, if your fluid dynamics don't look dope, then I don't know what your game looks old and dated in those ways. And it feels like now textures are a part of the thing that make everything feel as real as possible. Alongside that, in the gaming space, I think of Quixel immediately as a tool that a lot of folks are poking at and prodding at and saying this would be a really good thing to put within our pipeline. But I feel like the space that right now where I'm seeing so much of your work kind of come through is in the virtual production space, which has been wild. Again, everyone's been talking about, when Mandalorian first came out and started that trend towards, building those larger sound stages and having that background be as clear and as textured and as with high fidelity. How is virtual production ramp up kind of move the way you're all thinking about the work that you all do as well?
Yeah, I mean, virtual production is an incredibly exciting space, and we're very fortunate to have been able to work on a couple demos internally at Epic specifically for virtual production, ICVFX. So, I mean, it's an incredible space, right? Like, there's so much going on. The advancements in technology on the engine side just continue to blow everyone away. I think, with 427, we put out something that, from an ICVFX perspective, is just rock solid. We were seeing teams adopt it wholesale, and it's been really, really exciting. On the content side, there's still a massive demand, like, for digital content, right? Like, for, just as we were talking about it for games, right? I think the same applies for the ICVFX space. We're seeing a lot of teams do a lot of scanning specifically in productions that they're creating in more than just the ways that we kind of engage with it in the Megascan side, right? So just as an example, there's a lot of photogrammetry that's going on for people that are creating digital sets, and they want to preserve those digital sets to be able to keep in perpetuity, right? So imagine just the example that we love to throw around, right, is like, after Friends, right, stopped shooting, right, they tore that set down, right? And they're recreations of the set, but it's not the set of Friends, right?
Right.
And it's pretty cool to be able to now be in a space where we could even isolate the different components of the set of friends, or we could just scan the entire thing. And then let's say we pick up the ball 20 years down the road, right? We could relight the set. We could put, these people in there that we've, scanned digital versions of their faces, using MetaHuman, mesh to MetaHuman, all that type of stuff, and put all those characters back in that space. Like that's where we are, like, as far as the technology. And I think that is so exciting, right? And so that's why, like, from a scanning perspective, I mean, this is the tip of the iceberg as it relates to ICVFX.
Okay. So that means that I will one day get my digital version of Sanford and Son in the way of that holds at some point. I want to be virtual Red Fox who's like Elizabeth in my new virtual production space. That's what I want now that we've discussed it in this way. But that opens up my mind to so many different things. I know for me and Spawn on Me, we have been thinking about what the next version of our show is going to be, and virtual production has been kind of an avenue that I've been thinking about, right? It's like, what would it look like if you come into our show and I'm not in this room, but I'm on a virtual stoop in front of next to a bodega, right? And talking to you and doing all that stuff. All of those pieces are now kind of there to be used to be able to kind of figure that stuff out. Is there a space in which, like, what are some things that you would say we're still waiting to get to? I think, some folks are like, can you scan water? Can you scan, certain things that, aren't super solid? Like, clouds were a thing for a while of like, oh my God, these clouds look so good. Can you scan a cloud? I don't know. Is that, what are those things that people are having expectations that just maybe aren't there yet from a technology standpoint?
That's a great question. I think so. For us, the holy grail has honestly been trees for a long time. By far and away, that was the number one requested asset type in the library, and it wasn't even close, right? And the reason for that is because trees are incredibly complicated. There are solutions, for creating trees, and they're very successful in that, right? Like any major motion picture that you've seen, right, where there are tons of digital forests or anything like that in the background, right? Like, people have solved this problem, and they've done great work in that space. For us, we want to do it and have it be something that's actually based in photogrammetry as the base, right? And actually creating something that is parametric and science-based as well. So, we've literally built our system for creating trees from the ground up. And that was something that was incredibly complicated, breaking down every single component, right? And making parametric features associated with those trees, right? Like how many knots are in the tree, how many branches are on there, how many saplings grow next to the trees, what does the integration look like for the branches as it actually assimilates back into the actual main trunk. All these different components are things that we consider, right? And so we really want to make sure that we're doing nature, right, the service that it deserves, right, in this space, right? So trees for us were definitely the thing that I think, and we're still just kind of in the nascent phase of that as well, I would say, right? We've only released like one tree pack so far, and so we've got a lot of work to do. We've got a lot of really exciting trees that are in the pipeline. I would say that's a big one. As it relates to more complicated and more intricate type sets, I think that, hopefully in the future, being able to kind of, integrate, LiDAR and drones and all these different things back in with photogrammetry is something that's a really exciting space. Our friends, in Capturing Reality, they're another team here at Epic we recently acquired. They're doing some incredible work in being able to process large format scans, right? Digital preservation is something that we're really, really excited about too. The Sierra's project that I mentioned actually just before this is something that just real quick, just as like a quick aside, the reason that there's value here in something like that is that we actually scouted a specific place in the Sierras we wanted to go to, and that place burned down last year.
Oh, wow.
So that trip actually was completely, canned for the moment. We had to put it on the shelf and just say, all right, like we need to go back to the drawing board, figure out like what we can actually do here. And so being able to kind of tell those types of stories about preserving specific areas that we think have value, right? Like that's something that in nature, obviously, is something that we're incredibly tuned in with here at Quixel. So historic preservation, nature preservation, we do a lot of work, with those different agencies that are able to kind of get us into those locations, right? So like scanning in museums and the preservation, for different types of historical artifacts. Like those are all things I think that there's going to be an increased demand for going forward.
Ooh, I was about to ask you that, and just like an amazing guest, you nailed that answer for me before I even got to ask it. I was just wondering about that because I do feel like I remember very specifically there being various experiences that, I'd wished it had that extra layer of that realism that could be connected to kind of bring home historic moments or, recreations of certain things. And I was like, oh, if this had like that Quixel touch to it, this would have made it even more immersive in that way. Are you finding that, and I know I only have you for a couple more minutes, but I think two quick questions. One would be, I think the VR space has been one in which we've seen a lot of additions of fidelity there. Do you feel like folks in the VR space are also getting a benefit for some of the work that you're doing on the Quixel side too?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it's been a long time since I've done any development specifically in VR, right?
Yeah.
But I think like last time when I was developing in VR, one of the problems that we were running into specifically was actually related to normal map projection and actually being able to kind of get, meshes to actually look the correct way through both sides of the goggles, right? And
Mm.
I don't know if that problem has been solved since, like I said, it's been a long time since I've been developing specifically in VR, but what it means specifically for scanned content, I would say in the engine, right, is that with Nanite, right, and being able to bring in like cinematic quality assets that don't require or don't need normal maps specifically, that's something that I think that there's incredible value for the VR community if that's still something that they're dealing with. So basically, just with that, it's just the way that light engages with the map, basically creating like a projection of like a high to low sort of workflow. That was something that with the goggles at the time, it was something that was a big problem. So I don't know if that's been solved, but throwing more geo at the problem is great. So yeah.
That's awesome. Last question for you. We always like to leave on a super high note. And again, thank you for being with us. Was there ever a time you went on a scouting trip and you went to go on a scanning trip and you were like, holy crap, I have this thing, I have access to this thing that is very, very rare or very, very cool in that way that you got a chance to scan? Anything you can tell us, of course, nothing that you can't, but anything you got a chance to see that you were like, holy crap, we got to scan this thing that most people don't have access to.
I mean, I think the thing that I'm the most proud of is actually, we did our Valley of the Ancient project last year for the early access UE5 demo. And that was a really special project for me specifically. So that happened kind of in the peak of COVID. And what that meant for us, practically speaking, was that we did not have scanners that were able to come and be at that trip, specifically just because we weren't traveling.
Yeah.
So I'm based in Colorado. And, I have a colleague who's also here in Colorado. And so me and Dan, and then we got one other guy from California, we actually got to go to Moab, but we did all the scanning for that eco region, which is crazy because that's not Dan's job. That's not my job. Yeah. Like I don't do scanning. I do other stuff at the company, but it was so cool because it was such a special project to be able to be a part of and actually go and source that data. I mean, the trip to like, getting to the location that we scanned in was nuts. I mean, like literally it was like 90 minutes of hardcore like off-roading. Like I took my truck and I was legitimately worried for my life. Like just about every day going out to that location. But we're like, this is such a perfect spot to do scanning. It's exactly what we wanted from a shape language perspective. It was, I mean, if you've seen any pictures of Moab ever, it's almost alien-like. I mean, it's just insane, right? So we would get there super early, and to be out in the desert in that space, putting drones up in the air, scanning stuff, at like 5 a.m. I mean, it was such a special experience. And I think I'll remember that one probably forever. And the demo obviously came together really, really well. I think everyone that contributed just kicked ass on it. So it was just such an awesome experience. So yeah, I would say Moab for me.
That's rad. I love stuff like that because that's like, you get a chance. I love to hear folks who are around the technology that they play around with or they work with every day nerd out and get hyped about the stuff they get a chance to play. I mean, of course, you're getting to have a peek behind the curtain of all the goodies that are already happening and stuff that's coming down the line is even cooler. But I think, for the folks who are listening to this episode of Something Epic, I'm really hoping that they pulled away of just like how cool this tech is and how it is really helping to drive the future of games and experiences that we are going to see moving forward. I am hoping at some point that I will be able to get myself into a scan because I need all these beard hairs to be beautiful and in 8K. And at some point down the line, it feels like we're right around the corner from being able to have wild stuff just like in your house that you'll be able to kind of do that stuff. I will look sexy in basketball games when they finally get me together. Just don't get the side.
Absolutely.
Just don't get the sides, man. You don't need these in there. You don't need that in there. Galen, thank you so much for being on this episode of Something Epic. I am a huge fan of the work that you all do. I am, the outside evangelist for all the stuff that you're all doing because I think it's brilliant and I think it's really driving the experiences that we see moving forward. And I'm so excited for everything that's coming down the pipeline for you all. So again, thank you very, very much for being on the show with me and appreciate the time. I'd love to have you back on Spawn on Me proper at some point down the line.
Let's do it. Yeah. Thank you for having me on. This was awesome.
I love it. So everybody at home, we got a chance to talk to the folks from Quixel. I'm really excited about it. You know how much I've been trying to make this show happen and this episode happen. So here we go. We finally got it for all of you at home. So make sure you're giving some love to our friends over at Epic. Make sure you're giving them some love for sponsoring this content. Make sure you're giving all the folks at Quixel some love as well. And when you see that pop up on your game, just remember this interview when you got a chance to see that for games coming down the line. So we'll see you next month with a new episode of Something Epic. And until then, much love and peace.